Welcome back, DIYers, and let me just say I'm thrilled you came back to join me. Now, this is part 2 of the window trim replacement series. Now, I think you'll find part 2 a little more fun, and the reason is we're going to put our DIY skills to work. What do I mean? Well, if you remember back in part 1 in the demo phase where we was taking the old trim boards off, those hidden problems we uncovered, well, now we're going to fix those. And after that, we're going to nail up the new boards. I'm going to show you how I'm going to do that. I'm going to also tell you what kind of nails I'm using. Then we're going to caulk and seal everything up, keep the water out. Then I'll show off the finished project to you. Now, you're going to want to hang around to the end because that's where I'll go over the things I'd have done different and mistakes I made and how you can prevent the mistakes I made on your project. Now, if you know a better or easier way to do this project, leave me a comment down below. Or if you've done a project similar to this on your house, what issues did you run into? Let me know that also. Or just let me know what project you're currently working on. I'd love to hear about it. Now, for those of you who watched part 1, I deeply thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned something. And for those of you who haven't seen it, that's okay. I have a link down below in the description. You can go back and watch it after this one. Now, let's kind of do a quick recap over part 1. Part 1, we did demo where we removed the old trim boards. Then we had to cut back the siding to make room for the new trim boards. We custom cut our new trim boards, and then we primered and painted everything to prevent rot in the future. Now that we're all up to speed, let's get started. And the first thing we need to do is address those problems that we found. First thing I discovered is with this window flashing tape here, it's kind of rubber tarryized, if you will. Didn't go down all the way onto the window to seal the window. 2, I found out these cheap old aluminum windows don't have any insulative channels on the edges, and that's why I was getting condensation on the inside of the house in the winter. And 3, the part I thought I only had on the bottom is actually on some of the sides, and that is when I put the boards back in, they want to tilt. And I have a good idea of why that's happening, and I know how I'm going to fix that. So how I'm going to attempt to fix this is I'm going to take these trim boards off. So I'm going to cut down the edge of the trim board, which most of them have already been cut when I ran the skill saw up the side to cut the siding. But what I don't know is how are these boards oriented. Now this particular board here, it comes all the way down to here, and then this one butts into it, which is no big deal. I'm going to cut this, I'm going to take both of these off. But what I don't know, and I know it's going to be on some of these, is that when you get to the top, I don't think it's cut here. And this one actually runs across and this butts up to it. My worry is this one runs all the way up and this board butts into it. Now, I know there's some that don't do that, but I know there's some that do, and so we'll have to deal with that when the time comes. Okay, I've got all these marked. This is left and right and bottom, and this is the master bath, so I've got all those marked. Now, got me a nice new sharp blade in here. Now I know this board goes all the way down and this one butts into it, so basically I'm just going to cut that paper at the trim. Now a lot of these have already been cut on the edges because when I ran the circular saw up to fix the siding, but just in case, I'm going to run them back down and cut through. And when I do cut these, I do want to cut it at the edge of the board and not beyond that, and I'll explain why here in a minute. And actually, this particular board, I think, is a little too wide and it runs underneath some of this siding, and I'm going to have to fix that. Now, here's the first one, and I know, because I can feel the edge, it stops right here. How am I going to do this? Well, the only thing I can really do is cut along this mitered edge and then cut here. And when I take it out at the bottom and see if I can't rock it out and hope there's not a nail right here. Now, I'm not really sure what all it's going to take to get these out, but I got a few different tools here, and we'll see which way is the easiest without tearing things up. Nailed right through the flange, and I did what I was trying not to do, and I was worried about it. When I was cutting through this, I cut too deep, and I'll get you close up. But I cut through the tar paper, which means that's insulation and there's no lumber there. Before I put these back, I'm going to have to trim them down just a little bit. Good, no nail. You've got to treat this kind of like a roof. You've got to remember how water falls. It's going to fall from the sky anyway, from the top down. So anything that you put on for waterproofing, you got to keep that in mind. So it's just like your shingles on your roof. You start at the bottom of your roof and work your way up. And I need to put this bottom piece on so that when this top one comes, it'll come over it. So water runs this way and down, whereas on that other window I got like this, and the potential is the water to sit here and get under. But here, I'm gonna go lower because the risk of water penetration here is higher, because as I showed you, I've cut into here. Now this plastic's here great, and I cut this window flashing, but it looks like the majority of the plastic's intact, and that's great. But in case it's not, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go wider and get it underneath there and cover that, so I don't have to worry about it. So what I've done is I've pulled the siding up on the bottom where it's nailed to hold it away so I can get it down under there. And this stuff is very sticky, so once you get it down, you really don't have any adjustments, especially when it's hot like this. Now once I get down past here, there's no lumber. So you don't want to push harder, I'll push right through. Remember, it's siding, tar paper, and then my house. I've got no sheeting on the sides. For the sides, it's much easier because this just hangs and it doesn't want to flop over like it does on the bottom. But what was nice about this window is this board come all the way across and this one butted into it, so I could cut here and not have to peel it from underneath this board and worry about pulling this one up. The bad side of that is I should put this up underneath here if I want to follow the rules I talked to you about as far as rain, but I really can't, not without tearing up a bunch of stuff. So I'm not as worried up here because I've got the eave that's going to help shower the rain down further, which where this is going to be, and I'm not so worried. But I am going to cover some of it. I want a little bit, about 2 inches down there. Take my utility knife. And cut it. I want to push this up under that board, because when I put this back on, I'm going to have to butt it up against there, and I don't want an air gap and risk ripping this. So I needed to follow the contour of this board. Now we can stick it. Just peel a little bit off, just like that. So like I say, this is high enough up that rain's gonna have to blow up to get over it. I'm not really worried about it. All right, so remember I cut this butt joint wider, and so I'm taking advantage of the fact that this piece here has been cut. I took the nails out. I took the nails out of here, and then I'm going to use this wrap to go all the way across like that and cover all this that I cut. I wished I could have done that when I did the others, but unfortunately I couldn't. But on this one I can, so I'm going to. So it's really nice. I got the nails all pulled out of here, and I can just go behind here and set this in there. Now there's a nail right there. So what I'll do is just cut a slit where that nail is, and let this go around it. It's going to stay. Just like that. It's covered. When I caulk that, I haven't got to worry about a leak at all right there. So I decided to try a new plan, and that was to lift the siding up along the side of the window and actually cut a piece of this that would go under the siding and cover this cut mark, and that way sealing all of this up. Now, a lot of the nails got pulled out and some that didn't, I have marked off with little cuts so that this will fit in there, and it'll go in there about 1.5 inches and it'll cover that. And for those that I've already done, I'm going to go back, pull these up, and take a little 1.5 inch, 2 inch piece and put under there, and that way that's all sealed. So this is going to be a little bit of a pain in the butt, but we're going to make it work. I got this cut out because at the very top I couldn't get that pulled out enough for this to slide under there. So, but it's up high enough out of the way, it's not going to matter. And there's no cut up there for it to cover. So what I'm going to do first is get this up underneath here. Even if this is a pain, I have a feeling this side's going to be way easier than that side because of the fence. It's in. I had originally for it to go a little further this way, and somehow, well, it didn't. But that's okay because the piece that goes here will cover that and it'll be fine. And that reminds me, I screwed up again. I need to do the bottom first before I do the sides. So I'll go do the bottom next, and this will just have to be that way. Okay, so I should have done this from the beginning, and I thought about it, but for some reason I didn't. But on 3 of these windows, what I've done is before I put this window flashing on, I pulled the siding up away from the edge of the house. And I had this flashing wide enough to go underneath here, about 1 inch, and still hit here. So it covers all of it. So what I'm doing is having to go back and fix so that that little cut line is covered. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm basically taking my pry bar and prying out the siding. And then I cut a 2-inch piece of the flashing, so 1 inch of it would be on the tape that's there, and 1 inch would be under the siding, which will cover that cut line. And then I've cut little triangles out where it's going to hit nails. And I'll put this in here and stick it down, and once I nail down the siding, it'll be stuck real good and tight. Okay, here's a close-up. And there's where that seam is from the piece, the 2-inch piece that's underneath here. And I've got, some of these are face nailed because the nails came out, but it's down tight against that, holding it down tight. And if you remember, the cut line was right at the edge of the siding, and so I'm about 1 inch inside here and 1 inch out, so that's plenty to cover that. It keeps it all nice and watertight. All right, we got the windows sealed up. Now it's time to move on to the next problem, and it has to do with these set-off boards. So they go in here, and remember back I said I had a problem with the bottom trim tipping back a little bit. And actually I found a couple side trims that did the same thing. And the problem is in this offset piece right here. Now this is only 3/8 of an inch, but remember there's about a 1 inch wide nailing flange right here that you nail through to attach the window to your framing. And that thickness between there and when it hits the lumber underneath is just enough to cause this to tip when it sits in there. And then you stick a 1 inch board on top of that and it makes it tip even more. So we got to fix that. And then this problem's kind of a twofold problem, and that is some of these boards is too narrow, and then I've got this one that's too wide. So I've got to adjust that. And then the other thing is you see some of these actually rotted. So I'm going to have to replace those. So there was 18 boards in total that was taken off the windows. 3 boards to a window, 6 windows, 18 boards. Of those 18 boards, 11 of them were good. And what I mean by good is they weren't rotten, and either A, they were just the right width or a little wider than they need to be. So that leaves me 11 boards short. Where am I going to come up with those? Funny you should ask. Back when I replaced the old siding, I saved all those old boards. And luckily I did, because that's exactly what I'm going to use to make the new 11 boards that I have to come up with in order to have my 18 boards again. Then how I'm going to correct them so that they don't tip is I'm going to cut this little dado in here. And basically it's going to be about 1.25 inches deep, because that's about as wide as I need it. And then it's going to be to where the leftover wood's about 1/4 inch thick. Now all the old boards have this piece of window flashing on it, and that's okay. I'm gonna put a new piece of window flashing on all these so that the thicknesses match. I've got some leftover window flashing from when I did those windows, and it's gonna go to waste, so what better use than to put it on these, and then they'll all match. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rip all the good ones down to the proper width, and then we'll move on to making the new ones out of the old siding. Okay, first thing I do when I'm milling up the old siding to make the new boards is I cut the end off and get a good clean square end. Now this particular board here is about 184 inches long, and I'll be able to get a whole window, all 3 sides, out of this one board just from one edge. I won't need it from both sides. Okay, next what I'm going to do is measure out the length of each one. I'm going to give me a little bit of play and make them a little long, and I'll cut these up into manageable sections. Then I can rip them down to the final width. Then the next thing I do is I pick an edge, which one looks the worst. I think it'll be this one. As I'm going to just mill off, well, in this case probably about 1 inch. And I do that for each one. And then from that good edge, I'll measure however wide I need and get my final width. In case you're wondering about this table saw, I got it from Harbor Freight. I have a video about it. I'll leave a link. But for what I paid, this saw is doing great. The scale's pretty close. This fence sits even at each end and sits tight. I got no complaints out of this table saw. The other thing I do is I look down my cut edge and make sure I have all fresh and good, clean lumber. Now this bottom side I ain't worried about. I'm gonna fix that. So the next part, cut the width. Right on. So the last thing I have to do is, this is a side piece, and so I cut a 30-degree angle off of the end that's going at the top and leave just maybe 1/8 or 3/16 at most, probably 1/8 inch of meat at the end, and then cut it to final length. So that's how I mill up all these boards for these windows. I'll finish up what I got left, and then we'll move on to the next part of this, milling, and go from there. So I've got all my boards milled up, and I got one last thing I want to do to them, and that is to put this window flashing on them. Now I'm not necessarily putting it on there for protection. I mean, some of it is due to protection, but I'm doing it because the 7 boards that I reused have this on them, and so I want everything as a uniform thickness. Now, I had a bunch of this stuff left over in small pieces that was going to go to waste, so I used it up. And so it kind of looks like this. I've got seams and stuff. Like I say, I don't really care as far as having these seams. I'm not so much worried about weather protection as I am just wanting the same thickness. Now I did put it on the painted side, which it's already painted, so this on top of it with paint should do fine. So I wound up using up all my scrap pieces, and I'm down to just my full 6-inch wide strips, but I've only got 4 little pieces left to do. So here's what I'm doing. I cut one strip the full length of the longest one of these. I tape the back of it together. Then what I'm going to do is put it on here, and I'll cut it down the middle, and I'll get both of these at once, and I'll just have a small little sliver to put on here. And I got this right here that I can do that with, and I'll do the same thing with that one, and that'll finish this up. And the reason I had a bunch of these small narrow pieces left over is because when I was doing around the windows, I didn't need the full 6 inches. So it's quite easy to put this stuff on when you got all this room, whereas when I was doing the windows, I had to go around nails and pieces of siding and everything else. It made it a little more challenging. Just like that, I got 2 pieces done. Now I got 2 more. So there was one thing I forgot I needed to do to these offset boards or spacer boards, whatever you want to call them, and that is I need to cut this rabbet in here. Nailing flange on the window will sit in this little rabbet, and so this board doesn't want to tilt. And then when I put the window trim boards on top of that, they'll all sit flat. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut my 1 1/8 because that's what I've got it set at, and it's set dead perfect. Okay, I got the groove, if you will, cutting all of them. Now it's time to finish out the dado. All right, I'm down to the final problem to fix, and it has to do with these cheap old aluminum windows. And the fact that this channel here is just open to the wild environment. So, as I mentioned in part 1, in the winter, or at least in our Texas winter, when I have my heat on the inside and it's cold on the outside, I'd get condensation. And I'm gonna guess it's partly because this isn't insulated. So how I'm gonna fix that is a window and door spray foam. Now, why am I using this? Is because it's low expansion and it's not supposed to bow or warp when you use it on your windows and doors. So you'll see though in this, it does expand a fair amount. Not as much as if you use like what they call open cell spray foam. That stuff expands a whole bunch, but it does expand. And so there's actually a deep channel that runs down the inside and another one on the outside here. And so what I'll do is I'll take the tip and set it in there and spray along there and fill that up, and then I'll point it towards the inside and do the same thing, and then with the in-between I'll come back behind and fill. Then once that's all filled, I'll let that cure for about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to come back and actually push it back into the channel. And the reason is I tried on another window as an experiment to cut this, because it sounds like a great idea, but when I cut it, I found I had a bunch of open areas that didn't get filled. So I had to go back and spray and fill it again. So instead, what I'm gonna do is just push it back in there as far as well, I shouldn't say as far as it'll go, but push it back so it's flush to this edge here, and then let it finish curing. And then I'll come back. It's supposed to take 8 hours, so I'll come back at that point, and then I'll trim what's left. And by leaving it like that, it also keeps it sealed and closed, whereas you'll see on some of this I'm going to have to cut. It'll kind of open the cells. But I'm okay with that because this is all going to get covered. If I wanted, you can paint this stuff. I may or may not. We'll just have to see. So the other thing is along the tops. Well, this is a long window. I have no real good way to fill this other than if I took that off. Well, obviously I'm not going to do that. So basically what I'm going to do is put the tip in here as far as it'll go and just spray. And it shoots, you know, a fair distance. So hopefully between that and what it expands, it'll cover half this window. And then when I do the other side, I'll get the other half. I'll have no idea if it did or not, but that's the best I can do. So let me get this shook up. And speaking of shaking this, it says shake vigorously for 60 seconds. And I'm telling you, shake it for what you think is 60 seconds. Shake it again for what you think it's 60 seconds. And shake it one more time. And then just before you spray, shake it one more time again, because you really need this stuff mixed up well. A couple other things. I taped off the window flashing and the edge of this window, because I don't want this stuff to get on there and stick, because to get it off is a pain. If I have to use acetone to get off this window, it's going to take the paint with it. A couple other little supplies you need is some gloves, because you don't want this stuff on your hands. If you do, you got to use acetone to get it off. Speaking of which, you're going to need some acetone, and then have rags around for the cleanup. Plenty of rags. So one more shake, and just like that, we're done. Now, like I say, I'll give this about 20, 30 minutes. I'll come back behind and push this in. So I lied. My OCD wouldn't let me wait any longer than about 10 minutes. You see, all I did was I went along here with gloves and just pushed it in. And on the edges, pushed it in. And I'll finish letting this set up. Takes about 8 hours, and then I'll come back along and trim when I need to. Now in that time, since I pushed on it so early, it'll kind of puff back up some. Any of you know a better way, easier way, more efficient way, please let us know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear a better way to do this. Okay, final prep. That's getting this stuff cut off and cleaned up, and we can start nailing up the new boards. Now, this is the first window I did, and this is the one where I said I waited about an hour and come back and trimmed it and found all these holes and gaps. And so I went back and sprayed and put the spray foam in those holes, and that's where I discovered to do the push it in method. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this one, show you how I do it, and I'll show you the finished product. And then I'll show you one of the other windows where I did the push-in method after it's all been cut. And then we'll get started nailing these up. So all I'm gonna do is run this blade right down along that tape to cut loose. Now when I cut this, that stuff will fall away. And when I cut it, I'm not cutting straight in, I'm actually cutting it just a little bit of an angle and letting the tip of this blade right against the metal of the window and not on the flashing. Actually looks pretty good. Now I'll peel the tape off and we'll see the finished product. Okay, you can see how it looks. Okay, here's kind of a close-up of that finished window. And actually it really looks pretty good. So now we just gotta get everything set up to nail the new ones on. Okay, time's finally come. We're gonna get these boards nailed back up. Now, first thing I need to do is nail up the spacer boards. And for that, I'm just gonna use a finish nailer and an 1¼ inch finish nail, because all I needed to do is just hold it in place. I don't really need any structural support, because when I put the trim boards on, I'll nail through them and these boards and it'll hold it all in place. Now for this particular window, remember, this has to go up underneath here because, well, this board didn't come over. So hopefully it'll go back up in there as easy as it came out. Oh, in case you haven't noticed, I painted the back side of these also, just for a little added protection. Three nails ought to do it. A couple other things to note. If you remember back when I cut that 30-degree bevel, that's so when this goes up against here, it fits against this board here real tight. So as you can see, I didn't quite get this flashing tape up underneath there really tight. But I don't need to with that because it'll fit really tight. Then the other thing is this rabbet I put in seems to be doing the trick, because when I nail, the nailing flange goes in here. I'm not putting any nails in here, so I don't have to worry about it causing it to tip. I'm going to put them in through here. Okay, we're ready to nail up these new trim boards now. A couple things. One, remember I back beveled all these miters. So the first thing I always do is I make sure that it still fits well, it's tight. And then the next thing I do is I put caulking. I put a small bead of caulking on the front edge, and I put a larger one on the back edge because I want that to fill that back bevel so it's nice and full, and I want just a little bit of squeeze out in my miter that I'll wipe off. So when I get them up there and the caulking squeezes out, I use these little miter clamps to kind of hold it in place. And then I'm going to take my finish nailer again, but only this time I'm using 2½ inch finish nails, and drive a nail through there to kind of hold that. And then I nail the boards themselves with my framing nailer that has those 2 3/8 inch ring shanked hot dip galvanized nails. Now as I nail these, I've got the boards marked as far as where to put the nails from the sides, because remember, I don't want to nail through that nailing flange like they did, so I've got to be off of that and then a certain distance out here. And what I'll do is I'll nail all the insides first, that way it holds it tight, then I'll put the outside nails on. So I'll nail the other side up, and then I'll come back and we'll nail the bottom. Now I'm a little concerned about the bottom again, because I custom cut these to such tight tolerances. My worry is the paint going to throw it off, and if it does, I may have to trim those, at least one edge off a little bit, which will delay putting these back up because I'll have to primer and paint them again. But hopefully it won't, and I can put them up tight. I couldn't be happier the way this is going together. Now I got 4 other windows to do. I'll go do those, and then the next thing we'll have to do is come back and caulk everything up. So this project's done, and it turned out way better than I could have hoped for. Probably better than some of you even thought it would. Now really the only thing I got left to do is to go back through and caulk over the nail heads. In case you're wondering, yes, I peel bond primered over every nail head and then painted over it. Not so much because of the nails, because they're galvanized, but because of any exposed wood fibers. And then I'll caulk over them for a couple reasons. One, added protection, and two, to just try and hide the nails so it looks seamless. But I've got nice tight miters all the way around. I got no rotted wood. And what I'll do here is I'll kind of show you as a comparison before and after some of these corners, what they used to look like and what they look like now. And I think you'll agree that it looks awesome. Now this window here was pulled away and there's a big open joint. You can see it's caulked. You can still tell that it's got a gap there. And like I say, it's because the window's bowed. It's not because of the board. But I've got it nice and caulked and sealed up. You can see I've got a nice caulk line down the edge. And again, that is a very tight miter. And along the bottom where it was kicked out, this one's actually flush against the base of the window. This was a real ugly miter, gapped open really big. Now you see it's good and tight. Everything's nice and level. Again, good clean caulk lines all the way around. Remember how I talked about it had this big old gap. As you can see, it's caulked up, really nice. And once that's painted, it'll look beautiful. And I've got this expansion joint here that's caulked. Yeah, it's a little wider than I anticipated it to be. But again, it's nice and caulked. And once it's painted, I think it'll be invisible. And again, this window's against the fence. And so to see that, you're gonna have to really look hard for it. Now let's talk about mistakes and what I'd have done different for this part of the video. Now, first thing I would have done, and the mistake I made, was make sure I put the bottom window flashing on before I did the sides. That was one mistake. The other thing, I wish I'd have just gone through from the very beginning and raised all these siding and the bottoms away from the house and just use one big wide piece of that window flashing instead of in some of these I had to do it in two pieces because I thought of it later. And really, other than that, that's the only thing I can think of that is I'd have done different, or the mistakes I made. Otherwise, everything else went together very well and looks really nice. So leave me a comment down below what you think of the project, how it turned out. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, you learned something. Hopefully you can take away from this project and do on your own house. And until next time, happy DIYing.